So, hey, my name is Dr. Gordon Walker. I have a PhD in biochemistry, and I live here in California, where I go mushroom hunting a lot. My research in graduate school was mainly on yeast, which is called Saccharomyces cerevisiae. So this is the fungi that does fermentation and makes wine, bread, beer, basically any form of alcohol, but also leavens our bread around the world. So I spent a long time getting really interested in the nuances of fermentation and also how yeast and bacteria interacted in wine and how that affected wine quality. And it was an amazing way to start learning about fungi from this very sort of scientific perspective. And when I finally finished grad school, which took a long time, because PhDs take quite a while, they're really cool and you learn a lot, but man, does it take a while. I was living in New Zealand and I got really into mushrooms because I had some extra time and I was like, I finally have time to go hiking, I finally have time to be out in nature. And I started going out and I found lots of mushrooms. I was like, oh, these are so cool, it's so exciting. Because as a kid, I'd found like a puffball, I'd found chicken in the woods. I'd seen a couple of things as a kid that really got me interested, but I just didn't know enough. And I think as an adult, I was always kind of scared. I was like, well, I don't want to, go out into nature and end up touching something or eating something that could kill me. Mushrooms are scary, right? But here's the thing, they're not that scary. Compared to plants, mushrooms are way less scary. Because there are plants out there that if you just touch them a little bit, they can hurt you real bad. Whereas there's really no mushrooms that can effectively hurt you by touching them. There's one thing in Australia called the fire coral that you wouldn't really want to handle a bunch, but just touching a little bit probably wouldn't do that much damage. So there's a great lesson for you all. If the only thing you take away from this is that you can touch most mushrooms safely, even toxic ones. You don't want to lick your hands, but the way that a mushroom hurts you, the way that the toxins get into your body, is by eating it, not by touching it. So you can safely touch almost all mushrooms, no worries on that. If you go out and touch a bunch of mushrooms, come home and wash your hands, because that's always a good idea. But we're going to kind of launch into Mycology 101. I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a breakdown on what mushrooms are, where they function in nature, some advice on how to start foraging, how to start IDing them. And I'll talk about some of the basic types of mushrooms, and we'll also get a little bit into medicinal mushrooms, supplements. I'll answer questions about bioluminescent mushrooms, cultivation, all sorts of stuff like this. So if you guys are interested and you enjoy this little live stream that we're doing, I do have a podcast. It's called Fascinated by Fungi, and it's on all major podcast platforms, so you can find that and we can continue our conversation. I do regular live streams where we kind of just do normal mushroom Q&A, and I talk about cool mushrooms and show you guys how to cook them and how to work with them. So please check out my channel. I'm glad that we're here on TikTok and all you guys are watching. This is really fun to be teaching people about mushrooms. So again, I'm Dr. Gordon Walker. I have a PhD in biochemistry and I love fungi. They are something I'm super passionate about, and I'm glad I get to talk to you guys about them today. So question is, what's a mushroom? And how can they look so incredibly different from each other, right? These are both mushrooms, but they don't look anything alike. This is a pretty traditional looking mushroom, right? It has a cap, it has some gills, and has a stem. This one looks way crazier, and I assume some of you guys know what this is, but this is a lion's mane. So it's a polypore tooth mushroom, and it grows completely differently and lives very differently than one of these standard little cap and stem mushrooms. So these mushrooms in my little basket here are what are called wine caps. I grew these in my own backyard, and you can too. They're super easy to grow. I have some videos on how to grow these. This is a lion's mane, and it was grown on a block of sawdust and grain. You can also grow these pretty easily. I would recommend getting a kit to start with. As a side note, everything I'm talking about and everything I'm showing you guys today, these are legal, edible, wild mushrooms. There's nothing illegal about what I'm showing you. There's an unfortunate thing that whenever you say the word mushroom, people assume you're talking about illegal mushrooms. We will not be talking about those at all, so please don't ask me about them either, because TikTok is a place where we can only talk about things that are legal. So let's stick with that, okay? There's no tripping, nothing illegal about what we're doing. These are just wild mushrooms, and I'm trying to teach you guys about them, right? So I wish that all mushrooms weren't, some mushrooms weren't illegal, but we're just talking about the ones that are legal and the ones that we are allowed to talk about. So please do not project your misunderstandings about mushrooms getting you high, because that's not the kind of mushroom we're talking about, okay? Cool. So question is, what is a mushroom, right? Boom, what's a mushroom? Mushrooms are the reproductive fruiting body, sort of like the fruit or a flower of what's called mycelium. And the mycelium is really the body of the mushroom, and that's living down in the soil, it's living in the wood, where it's growing through. Mycelium is like little white wispy threads that are kind of growing all over, and they're excreting enzymes to break down the substrate, the wood, the soil around them, and drawing in nutrients from the enzymes they put out to break stuff down, drawing that nutrients in, and eventually they make a decision to form a mushroom. So there's two different ways that mushrooms are reproducing. The mycelium itself is able to keep growing through things, and that's called clonal or vegetative growth, and it's growing through the substrate, continuing to colonize it. Often when mushrooms start to run out of, or the mycelium starts to run out of nutrients, that's when they'll go ahead and produce a mushroom, because the mushrooms are a way that the fungi are reproducing sexually, and that allows them to have an evolutionary sort of advantage over the past generation. They mix up their genes and they try out new things, and so it's good for mushrooms to reproduce sexually and produce these spores, continue spreading. And often what they do is the mushroom will pop up, the spores will fall down, and then it'll colonize that top layer of soil and other stuff, which helps kind of cement the mycelium and keep the population going. So it is good to like have mushrooms there dispersing their spores, but mushrooms are also sending spores out further places, trying to colonize more spots. So there's different lifestyles that mushrooms live. The one that you guys have probably heard of, and is the most exciting, is one called mycorrhizal. And that's when the mushrooms are living in association with a host plant. And something like 85 to 95% of plants on this planet have a mycorrhizal partner. So fungi are very, very common, and fungi and plants came to land together. And fundamentally, fungi and plants are different because plants use photosynthesis, i.e. the energy from the sun, to create sugars for themselves to live on. Whereas fungi are like us in that they have to eat food, they have to eat organic matter and break it down to make energy. So plants are what are called autotrophs, and then fungi and animals are what are called heterotrophs. So fungi and animals are more closely related on an evolutionary timeline than plants. They diverged from plants, but that still doesn't mean that fungi and animals are closely related. There's several million years worth of evolution in between those, several 100 million years worth of evolution between fungi and animals, so they are quite different. Hey Katie, how you doing? So it's, knowing a mushroom is not a plant is one of the main things that you have to understand if you want to start learning about fungi and mushrooms. They aren't plants, they don't have chloroplasts, they don't do photosynthesis. They're eating and decomposing food in a very similar way that we do. There's even some other similarities between animals and fungi. Fungi have a polysaccharide which is called chitin, and it's the same thing that makes up the shells of arthropods like insects and crabs and stuff like that. So chitin is just a small component of many different types of polysaccharides that are in mushrooms, and mushrooms are actually full of a lot of really good dietary fiber. There's all these beta-glucans and mannoproteins and other things that really benefit our gut bacteria. So humans have a microbiome. We're essentially a living, breathing collection of human cells plus bacterial cells, and the composition of those bacterial cells in our gut has a lot to do with human health. And so by eating lots of mushrooms, the fiber in mushrooms works as what's called a prebiotic. So it's feeding different populations of bacteria, because these mushrooms are full of lots of very complex sugars that have a lot of weird linkages, and you need specific types of bacteria to break apart those linkages and eat the sugars in the mushroom. So one of the mushrooms that actually has a lot of really cool polysaccharides in it is a lion's mane. And they smell good, they taste good, and they're supposedly good for brain health. I think that that's kind of a step too far, and there's a medical aspect to fungi where people are being sold mushrooms as adaptogenic supplements, and I think that is over-promising what mushrooms can actually do for you. The real benefit of mushrooms comes from just eating them and getting good mushroom fiber into your diet that feeds good populations of bacteria, and that also helps to stimulate your immune system, because some of those mushroom sugars are broken down into small pieces and then fed to your white blood cells, and your white blood cells are then able to use those little bits of mushroom sugars to help recognize foreign invaders in the body. So it's pretty awesome that just eating mushrooms is going to give you protein, it's going to give you fiber, it's going to increase your amounts of good bacteria in your system, and it's going to stimulate your immune system. Also for vegetarians and for vegans, mushrooms are the only non-animal source of vitamin D. We can make vitamin D, sun on your skin makes vitamin D, but say it's winter or you're not able to get outside, eating mushrooms is a great way to supplement vitamin D. And that's another good thing because one of the main things I think in getting infected with COVID is actually having low vitamin D levels. So the more vitamin D, hopefully the more resistant you are to gnarly diseases and stuff like that. So that's what we're going on about. I was talking about mycorrhizal mushrooms. So there's mushrooms that associate with a host plant. There's what are called ectomycorrhizal mushrooms. So those are things like an amanita, a chanterelle, a bolete. They are growing in association with the host tree. There's another kind of mycorrhizal association which is not ectomycorrhizal. This kind doesn't form mushrooms, but it makes up a majority of the mycorrhizal associations. So ectomycorrhizal mushrooms only account for maybe 4 or 5% of all the plant associations. The other roughly like 85, 86% of associations that fungi have with plants on the roots that are mycorrhizal are called arbuscular mycorrhizae. And those are tiny little microscopic fungi called glomeromycota, which don't actually produce mushrooms. So when we're talking about mycorrhizal things and the sharing of nutrients through the forest, those are ectomycorrhizal mushrooms. And that's really good to understand ectomycorrhizal versus arbuscular mycorrhizae. Someone asked, do I study other kinds of fungi? Yes, I study all kinds of fungi, and my PhD is actually in yeast and Saccharomyces cerevisiae fermentation-based stuff. So I'm talking about mushrooms now, but I can go on and on about the fungal kingdom as a whole. And if you guys want to come join me another time, I've been reading this book, The Hidden Kingdom of Fungi, live on TikTok and talking to you guys about a lot of the other kinds of fungi that are out there, ones that are helpful for plants, ones that hurt plants, ones that are in our homes, in our fridges, ones that ferment foods, all sorts of stuff like that. So we have mycorrhizal mushrooms, which are associated with plants. Then we have saprobes, which are decay mushrooms, and that's majority of the things that we grow and cultivate as mushrooms are saprobes. So like this lion's mane is a saprobe, these wine caps are saprobes, and that means they're eating dead and dying material. So it's much easier to cultivate a mushroom that you can put onto a substrate, where the mycelium will colonize the sawdust or the straw or whatever plant material you're giving the mushroom. And then once it sort of digests all the plant material, it's going to go ahead and produce a mushroom. And that is what a saprobe does, making it fairly easy to cultivate them because we can control that whole cycle. It's very difficult, nearly impossible, to cultivate mycorrhizal mushrooms because there's a whole cycle of life that has to go on with like a tree and the mushroom in the ground and getting their two things to associate, and then timing of when the fruiting body shows up is complicated. They've sort of figured it out with truffles because truffles are so expensive that there is a market for essentially creating truffle plantations. They call them trufferys, but those are very, very difficult to set up. They're very expensive. They take a long time. I did a 3-part video series on truffles if you guys want to go back to my Mushroom 101 playlist and watch that. It's a pretty cool one. But yeah, trufferys are set up. But that's really the only like mycorrhizal mushroom that you'll find them cultivating. And for everything else that we're cultivating, all the other mushrooms you'd see in the store or you'd be able to buy online as a sort of a kit are going to be saprobes. So those are things that are decaying things. And then there's parasitic mushrooms. And those parasitic mushrooms might take the form of something like a cordyceps, which you guys have heard of, where there's like a bug that gets infected with this fungus. The mycelium of the fungus grows all through the body of the bug. Usually it's an ant, but there's some very host-specific things that I'm not talking about. And it'll cause the insect to climb up to a particular point on a branch. Like the insect is alive, but essentially a zombie because it has no capacity to control itself. Instead, the mycelium is literally forcing this ant or insect to march up a leaf. And then halfway up, a crazy looking mushroom sprouts out of the ant's head and starts raining spores down on the ants below, trying to infect them as well. So that's a pretty crazy kind of lifestyle to live. And then we have mycorrhizal that associate with plants. We have saprobes that are decaying dead plant stuff. And then we have parasitic fungi that can infect insects, they can infect other mushrooms, they can infect plants. There's all sorts of different ways that fungi live life, and it's a pretty wild assortment of things. So there's 2 big categories of mushrooms that I want to talk about, and they're called basidiomycetes and ascomycetes. And so the 2 mushrooms that exemplify this the most are probably like an Amanita muscaria and a morel mushroom. So Basidiomycetes are the majority of what we recognize as mushrooms. They're cap and stem, they're polypores, they're most things that we know as mushrooms. The other ones that are ascomycetes are things we don't recognize necessarily, but people know what morels are for the most part. But other little cup fungi and lichens, and there's a whole bunch of fungi that look sort of non-standard. Even truffles and cordyceps are actually ascomycetes. So those are a lot of the weird stuff in the fungal kingdom, things we don't necessarily recognize immediately as a mushroom, end up actually being an ascomycete. So like I said, morels, cordyceps, truffles. I really like this. My friend Jackie Hader Art made this cute little like morel friend for me. And I like this is actually, I think it's a chew toy or maybe a toddler toy, but it's a fun little Amanita thing. So we have the basidiomycetes and the ascomycetes. And the difference is that basidiomycetes have their spores in what's called basidia. So it's sort of this club-shaped, like fist-like structure. And the spores are hanging on the end of that. And so that basidia will hang down underneath a cap on the gills of the cap. And the spores will hang here, and a little bit of wind blowing by will just release the spores off into the air. Ascomycetes instead have their spores in what's called an ascus. So this is sort of like a needle-like sac full of spores, and at least in a morel, those spores are, the sac is pressure sensitive. So if you have a morel and you blow on it, it'll cause all those little sacs full of spores to rupture and shoot their spores out into the air currents, trying to disperse them. Ascomycetes are also what include Saccharomyces cerevisiae, yeast, which is what I did my PhD research on, and it's also what makes bread, wine, beer, all that kind of stuff. So pretty exciting. I get a question a lot from people, which is, can I touch mushrooms? And I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions people have, is they think that mushrooms are going to hurt them if they touch them. I can tell you right now that you can touch 99.9% of all mushrooms with absolutely no issue. They're not poisonous to touch. Even the mushrooms that are poisonous can't hurt you just by touching them, because the poisons in mushrooms don't diffuse across your skin. You could eat a poison mushroom and get sick, so don't do that. In fact, in general, don't go around eating anything you can't ID. I would highly recommend that, because I get this question a lot too, is people say, is this edible? And I'm like, well, how about instead of asking me whether or not you can eat it, you just say, what is this? Because that's a huge step in your understanding to see that if there's a mushroom, don't just assume you can eat it, right? That's not safe. Try to ask, what is this? And I get hundreds, if not thousands of requests a day of people asking me to ID their mushrooms. Happens quite a bit here on TikTok, especially in the summer when there's lots of mushrooms growing, and people want to know what's edible and what's not. And that's a very reasonable thing. I got into mushrooms because I was interested about what I could eat, and it was kind of disappointing to learn that a majority of the things that I found weren't edible, or I shouldn't eat them. But that's okay. You really don't want to take a risk when you're looking at what to eat, right? You want to stay safe. So the best thing to do is stick with mushrooms that you can get at the store, or maybe you can get at a farmer's market, or hell, you can even grow some yourself, like these wine caps and lion's mane. It may not necessarily be sustainable for all of us to go into the woods and go foraging, but if you do want to go foraging, and if you have access and time and opportunity to go foraging and look for edible mushrooms, there's some basic steps you should take that will keep you safe. So, and again, as a side note, a lot of the things I'm talking about right now, if you aren't getting it or want to hear me talk about it later, I do have a podcast, Fascinated by Fungi, that you can listen to a lot of the same stuff. I also have the FAQ linked in my bio that answers a lot of the same questions that we're going over right now. So the resources I use when I find a mushroom and I want to know what it is, I'll take my phone and take a picture of it. And the way to take a good mushroom photo is to include some of the stem, some of the underneath the cap, usually gills, and maybe a little piece of the cap, or better yet, you can take two separate mushrooms and sort of put them side by side like this. So you get underneath and the top of it at the same time. If you take a picture like that in where the mushroom was growing in context, a lot of people can at least help you ID a mushroom off of that. If you take a photo of a mushroom just from the top down out of context, I have no idea what it's going to be. So sometimes learning how to ID a mushroom is as important as it is just learning how to take a photo of a mushroom. There's some great apps out there that can actually help you learn what mushrooms are fairly robustly. My favorite one is called iNaturalist, and it's a website too, so it's inaturalist.org. or just iNat, the app. There's another app called Seek, S-E-E-K, that's also by iNat. And all you have to do with that app is to take a photo of a mushroom, upload it, and it will tell you, use its algorithm to tell you what it is. It's not always correct, but it's right more often than not. And it's a better app than anything else out on the market. The important thing for me is that iNaturalist is free. They will not charge you a subscription. They will not try to get you to buy anything. It's funded by the California Academy of Sciences, and it actually really works for literally any living thing. It doesn't work with just mushrooms. It also works with birds and plants and flowers. Like everything you can imagine that's alive, it can probably tell you what it is. Again, it's not perfect, but it's a pretty good starting point if you have no idea. The other thing you get out of iNaturalist is there's a lot of experts on there, and in your area, they will review what you've found and can give you a better idea sometimes than what you think. The other thing I absolutely love about iNaturalist is all of the metadata from iNaturalist, like the metadata from your photos, gets uploaded to their central databases, and researchers and scientists have access to that data. And so we can look at the distribution of species as a function of climate change, as a function of human activity and stuff like that, by the observations that people are making on iNaturalist. I just think that's really, really cool. So it's a great way that you can get involved in science by just, taking your dog for a walk and taking a couple of photos of whatever cool mushroom you saw while you're out on a walk. And I absolutely love that. So let's see. Oh, there's some other good resources I'd recommend. There's mushroomexpert.com. There's a lot of good Facebook groups that are localized. If you're going to buy a book, make sure you get a book that's fairly recent, so it was published in maybe the last 5 years. Make sure it's local, so it's specific to your area in some way. And there's a lot of other resources too. And like I said, if you guys want to get in on seeing the resources, I recommend check out the FAQ link that's in my bio. But you can also check out my podcast. The first couple episodes there are really focused on trying to help you guys figure out what to do as a mushroom hunter. So we're going to talk really quickly here about a couple different general types of mushrooms. So we have our standard cap and stem mushroom and agaricales, and there's lots of versions of this. There's many different colors and shapes and stuff of this, but they're all generally built with a cap and a stem, and we recognize those generally as mushrooms. There are things that are called polypores, and those are often growing on dead wood, and they'll have either little pores underneath, or in this case the lion's mane has kind of little teeth on it. So polypores look very different. They often present as big conchs or shelves that are growing on dead wood, which again is very different from cap and stem mushroom. There'll also be tooth fungi, so fungi that have little teeth underneath. Instead of having gills, they'll have little teeth under the cap, and those are really cool. You've got some mushrooms. Let's go to the poster here of all our edible mushrooms, and we'll talk a little bit about what's on here before we're all done. And I know everyone's always asking me about edible mushrooms, so let's at least talk about some edible mushrooms before we're done. Let's see if I can get into the frame here while we're on here. Oh, hey Chloe, welcome. So yeah, we've got coral mushrooms. So these kind of look like crazy underwater coral, and you'll see coral mushroom and club fungi. There are things like this, which are sort of like Cantharellus, chanterelle-like mushrooms. And these have what are called decurrent gills or ridges that run down the stem of the mushroom. Here's an example of a tooth mushroom, this little hydnum. It's a hedgehog mushroom, has little teeth under the cap. But a lot of mushrooms, are cap and stem type mushrooms. There are things called morels, Morchella species, and I've done a lot of videos on these. Verpa is a related species, but morels have little holes in the caps because they're ascomycetes and they look a little bit different. There's also cup fungi, so little cups you'll find growing in wood chips. Those are pretty common ascomycete forms. Sometimes you'll see stuff like cordyceps, where it's just poking out of the head of a dead ant. That's really cool. I'm trying to think of all the other, so many different kinds and shapes of mushrooms. They're what are called pluteroid mushrooms or oyster mushroom-like looking things. There's a whole class of stuff called gasteroid mushrooms, and that's anything where the spores are developing on the inside of the mushroom. So a puffball is a gasteroid mushroom, earth balls are gasteroid mushrooms, stinkhorns are gasteroid mushrooms, even bird's nest fungi, the tiny little sort of cups that grow in wood chips, and they'll be like inside. It looks like a little cup full of little birds' eggs, and that's why I call them bird's nest fungi. Those are gasteroid mushrooms as well. So yeah, I mean, there's just a wild variety of the shapes and forms of different mushrooms that are out there, and they're all super cool. The biggest thing, and again, people always ask me, how do you tell what's edible versus toxic? And all I can really tell you is, I have 2 posters behind me, there and there. Can you tell which one's edible and which one's toxic by just looking? No, not necessarily, and that's the important part. You can't tell by just looking at mushrooms what's going to be edible or toxic. There's no general rule that you can follow. You have to actually learn each mushroom individually. So that's where I recommend getting an app like iNaturalist, getting a book that can help you ID stuff, joining a Facebook forum where you can post photos and get feedback from people. And really what I suggest is if you want to learn how to gather mushrooms and go out and look foraging for edible mushrooms, it's a lot like leveling up in an RPG. You start out maybe looking for one mushroom that you're fairly certain of. So say you find someone teaches you what a chanterelle looks like and how to find chanterelle. So it's like starting a game as a level 1 wizard, and all you know how to do is spam fireball. So you go into the woods and you spam fireball, i.e. you just search for chanterelles all the time. And while you're out there spamming fireball, you're going to kill a couple of skeletons. You're going to find a few other mushrooms and take a look at them. Ideally, you take a photo with your phone, you upload that photo to iNaturalist, and you start learning about all the different kinds of mushrooms that are out there, and you start to level up. Maybe level 2, you start finding black trumpets, and well, those are pretty good edible mushrooms. Level 3, you find a chicken in the woods. Level 4, you just learned whirlwind, and really you've just learned how to pick a orange lactarius or something like that. There's all sorts of incredible edible mushrooms out there, and don't be afraid to go out and touch them. Touch them, smell them, feel them, get a sense for where they live in the environment, start to understand if it's a saprobic mushroom or a mycorrhizal mushroom, where it sits on the sort of spectrum of different kinds of mushrooms, and that'll give you a much better sense of like what kind of mushroom it is. One of the main things people do when they're first getting started is they'll do stuff called a spore print. So if you can't tell what the spore color of a mushroom is, I know for a fact that this has kind of dark brown purpley spores, but if I didn't, I could come home and I could cut the stem off of this, put this cap onto a piece of aluminum foil, usually works best, and then you can put a cup over it, or you can just let it sit there without too much air moving around it. And after a couple hours or overnight, you'll have a nice spore deposit that'll tell you the color of the spores, as well as it's kind of pretty to see like the way the spores deposit from different mushrooms. So that's one of the things you can do is early on when you're like just starting to get used to mushrooms is make a spore print, look at the spore deposit, start to understand the different identification features of a mushroom. And often it's, the color of the cap, the texture of the stem, the color of the gills, what color the spores are, where it was growing, how it was growing, what season it was growing in. In a lot of the country, it's definitely mushroom season right now because we're in summer and there's just a phenomenal variety of awesome mushrooms that are out there. And I encourage you guys to go out into the woods and look. To become a mycologist, you don't really need to do anything more than just go out into the woods and start looking for mushrooms. If you really want to, I would recommend getting like a basic degree in biology. There's not very many places that do specialized mycology degrees, but you can just learn about biology on your own and start learning about mushrooms. Some of the most famous mycologists out there don't actually even have college degrees, and so you don't necessarily need to have a higher education to start learning about mushrooms. You can just start learning, and that's what's really cool about apps like iNaturalist and coming here on TikTok and learning from me and from other great creators. Alexis Nicole is a great one. Gabrielle Chaotic Forge is a great one. If you just go look at the people I follow a lot of other mushroom accounts, and I would highly encourage you to follow some of the other people in the community. I do education here on TikTok, but also Instagram. I have a YouTube. I have a Pinterest, a Facebook, so I'm on all the different social medias, and there's a phenomenal community of people out there who are teaching all about mushrooms and really want you to learn and to be safe and be responsible with mushrooms. So I know there's a big temptation to always say, well, you can eat every mushroom once. It's not even true. There's a whole bunch of mushrooms that are so woody or so slimy or so gross that you couldn't even eat it. But don't go around just eating random fungi, right? That's not a good idea. If you're gonna get a mushroom, you make sure you know what it is, make sure you've 100% ID'd it, make sure you know it's edible. Go ahead and cook it well, because you really don't want to eat raw mushrooms. I see all the time people getting sick from eating raw shiitakes or raw oyster mushrooms. Both those mushrooms in particular can make you sick if you eat them raw, and they're very common mushrooms that people eat all the time. Make sure you cook your mushrooms well. And if you're trying a mushroom for the first time that you've never tried before, maybe just try a small bite and wait to see how your system reacts, because there's plenty of good edible mushrooms that can still make people sick or feel unwell if they haven't had it before and they don't know that their body has a reaction to it. A great example is something like chicken of the woods, which literally can make people vomit or squirt out of both ends if their body can't handle it. There's sort of an allergy, like 1 in 20 people just can't eat chicken of the woods. So it's a very easy to ID mushroom that's delicious and great to find, but first time you try chicken of the woods, make sure you cook it really well and just try a small piece, because the more you eat, the more likely you are to squirt out of both ends if you happen to have that allergy. Same goes for like touching mushrooms. You can touch 99% of mushrooms safely, but there's a few people who will get different types of skin reactions. So if you have a lot of allergies or you're sort of worried about touching stuff in nature in general, just be careful with mushrooms. You can always put on a pair of gloves if you want to, but I generally don't. I get my hands all nice and dirty, and if anything, going out into the woods and getting completely covered in mushroom gook helps me feel better. I come home, and if I had a little bit of a cold, it's gone because my immune system has been activated. My immune system has kicked into high gear as I've been exposing myself to all these different kinds of mushrooms. So I've also seen a few people say they like the shirt that I'm wearing. This is a parrot mushroom shirt. Also have this awesome lobster mushroom design. They're on my website. They're on t-shirts. I'm on a couple of different other products as well. So if you guys would like to order one of these, go for it. I would love your support. I do have a Patreon. I do have merch on my website. So if you guys like what I'm doing, by all means, please feel free to support me. Gifts and tips are always appreciated here too. But I do a lot of like mushroom education stuff like this on a fairly regular basis. And I'm really thankful for everyone who showed up today to like talk about mushrooms and get excited with me about fungi. Like I said, I do have the podcast, the Fascinated by Fungi podcast. If you like the way I talk about science and you want to learn with me, please check that out. It's on Spotify, Apple, Callin, and YouTube. I do have a YouTube, I do have a Facebook, I have an Instagram, I have all these other social media. So please follow me across all platforms if you'd like to. Okay, let's see. I will go ahead and answer a couple of your guys' questions. They were coming in so hot and fast for a while that it was difficult to keep up with, but I will go ahead and look now. Thank you, Jordan. I appreciate that you think my Instagram is awesome. I do slightly different things here on Instagram from TikTok and vice versa. I'm able to write a little bit more on Instagram, so I generally put more sort of educational context into my posts on Instagram. Sometimes here on TikTok, I just like do a fun mushroom ASMR video, but I'm kind of all over the place, so. My favorite mushroom is a really difficult question to answer because there's so many of them. I did a whole podcast episode answering what's your favorite mushroom. The question of what's your favorite fungi is easier because that's Saccharomyces cerevisiae, that's yeast. That's what does bread, wine, beer fermentation. It's what I did my PhD on, and it's definitely one of the things that really got me interested in fungi in general, and then mushrooms in particular. Were sort of came out of, had many experiences as a kid, one of which is actually with a parrot mushroom when I was like 4 years old. And I tell the story of that in my first episode of my podcast. So I don't actually study mushrooms. My PhD is in fermentation and biochemistry. And so I've worked adjacent to the wine industry and I've helped a lot of people with fermentation type processes, but I don't actually do research on mushrooms. I know a lot of people that do research mushrooms and I think it's awesome. I, for the most part, just have fun foraging them, cooking them, and teaching you guys about mushrooms. So, yes, and thank you, Chloe, because we cannot talk about the magic mushrooms, not allowed to talk about them here on TikTok. I wish I could. I think it'd be really cool. I do talk about them on episode 7 of my podcast, so if you want to hear my thoughts on that kind of mushroom, go listen to episode 7. Jordan, you said, are there any interesting midwinter mushrooms to look for? It really depends on where you live. If it's California in midwinter, there's a ton of awesome stuff because our mushroom season is in midwinter. Whereas for most of the country, if it's frozen and it's cold, there's not going to be any mushrooms. Michigan winter's probably not, Jordan. There's a few like late fall mushrooms you might find, stuff like the late fall oyster, maybe Flammulina velatipes, the wild cousin of enoki mushrooms. Those will grow in late fall, probably not full winter, but they're out there in the Midwest. Yes, the podcast is also called Fascinated by Fungi. It's on Apple, Spotify, Callin, YouTube, etc. The links to the podcast and many of the other things I've been talking about are linked on the FAQ link in my bio here on TikTok, so you can check that out. What season is best to find mushrooms in Washington State? Well, Taylor, I mean, Washington State is probably, arguably, maybe the best state in all of the country for mushrooms because you can find mushrooms pretty much year round because you're in the Pacific Northwest. I would say heading into the winter months is probably the best season for mushrooms, but frankly, like late summer, I know I have friends in Washington that right now are in the mountains picking morels and porcini as long as they're high enough up. On the coast, there'll be stuff like chanterelles and lobster mushrooms. Heading into winter, you're going to start getting like boletes and then chanterelles and, I don't know, black trumpets and hedgehogs and all sorts of tasty stuff. I live here in California. Oregon is also a wonderful, wonderful place for mushrooms. Yeah, whole Pacific Northwest, basically from like Washington, Oregon, down to Northern California, is one of the best mushroom hunting zones in the entire world, in my humble opinion. I had a lot of fun mushroom hunting in New Zealand. That was a really cool place to go mushroom hunting. When I go back to the East Coast, so I go visit my parents in Massachusetts, and there's a phenomenal number of mushrooms all over the eastern seaboard and out into the Midwest that are fruiting all through summer. Oh, someone gave me glasses. That's cool. Thank you. Yeah, there's mushrooms in Illinois. There's all sorts of cool things. All you have to do is get out into the woods after some rain, and sort of my advice on it is you want to go out and look for mushrooms probably 2 or 3 days after like a really big soaking rain, and that's a good time to go look. There are mushrooms in Texas, but probably in like humid, wet areas rather than those super dry areas. But there is a Central Texas Mycology Society, so you could check them out. They're on Instagram. Someone asked me about books. I do recommend some books. I would say go look at the links in my my FAQ because I get asked about that a lot. So I have my favorite books on my FAQ. One that I have with me right here that I really like is called Entangled Life. This doesn't have a lot of photos of mushrooms, but it's a great book about mushrooms. It's written by Merlin Sheldrake, who's actually Cosmo Sheldrake's brother. Pretty cool guys. This is a really entertaining book. I read that on TikTok at one point. My favorite one here for California and the Pacific Northwest is called Mushrooms of the Redwood Coast. This is probably the gold standard for what really any mushroom ID book should look like. I'm actually in the process of writing my own book. So once that's done, probably about another year or so, I will be recommending my own book as the one that you want to start with because I'm trying to write a book that really helps people see mushrooms from like a bird's eye perspective and also gives them a lot of good specifics without getting overly sciencey. So it's going to be kind of fun and topical the way that my Instagram and my TikTok is, and hopefully teach you guys all about that. Another one that I really like is called The Mushroom Hunter's Kitchen. This is definitely my favorite mushroom cookbook. It's by my friend Chad Hyatt, and he does some really, really cool recipes in here. He's a Spanish, like classically Spanish-French trained chef, so there's a lot of sort of like Catalan, Basque influences in this cookbook, but he does a lot of like Asian dishes and other stuff too. And it's a lot of mushrooms that are non-standard. So if you're a forager and you want to get into eating a lot of different kinds of mushrooms, this is a great book because it'll give you so many different ideas. So apparently I look like a fairly famous football player, which is cool. I guess that guy's a good player, so I appreciate that. But no, I am. I used to get Prince Harry a lot, but apparently Kevin De Bruyne is now more famous than Prince Harry. So whatever. I don't think I actually look like that guy. I just think people have a very difficult time looking at fair-skinned people and telling them apart. So it's kind of a weird. It's a weird thing. But anyhow, we got mushrooms. We're having fun. I got lion's mane. I got wine caps. I have my little like amanita and my little morel here. So Basidiomycete, Ascomycete. Anyhow, yeah, let me know if you guys have questions. I think we did the full-on TikTok stream there, which was wild. For we had over 2,000 people watching the stream for a little while, and that was pretty cool. So it's been really fun to be on here with you guys and talk about mushrooms. One of my favorite things to do is during mushroom season, when I come home, I lay out a whole bunch of mushrooms on my counter and I set up my camera and I just go through and teach you guys all about each different kind. This one was a little bit more of just like a mad dash to try to like fit in as much information as I could within the amount of time that I had. But yeah, I mean, I appreciate anyone who's still hanging out and has questions for me or has feedback for me other than the fact that I look like some footballer, which is cool. But I have a PhD in biochemistry, which I would argue is kind of cooler than being a famous football player. But yeah, I think a lot of people would probably disagree with that. But I have a lot more respect for academics and professors than I do for like sports stars or musicians. I think going into academia and studying science is way cooler and way more exciting than pretty much anything else you could do in life. But it's because I'm a nerd, and that's what I think is cool. So, everyone has their own definitions of what they think is cool. This is not a macaw, this is a parrot. For a parrot mushroom, that's what I'm paying tribute to. These are hygroscopic mushrooms, wet, viscid, waxy caps. And so they're sort of shiny looking. And this green one here is what's called a parrot mushroom, thus the parrot mushroom sitting on the parrot mushroom with the little hygroscopies all over. So, and hygroscopies are often very like cool colors, so from green to yellow to red. There's some really cool little like blue mushrooms and stuff like that. So, what's an environment you hope to forage mushrooms in one day? Man, I really want to go to parts of China because there's some cool stuff there. I'd like to go to like Queensland, Australia, see some of the amazing fungi down there, down in Tasmania. I really want to go truffle hunting in like somewhere in Eastern Europe. Slovenia would be really cool. There's some amazing mushrooms down in Africa. There's this enormous one that grows with termite mounds that gets very, very large. So I'd love to go to Africa and see that. There's a plethora of amazing, tiny, little, beautiful fungi that are in like the Amazon and the cloud forests of Ecuador. I'd really like to get down to Chile. There's an amazing organization called the Fungi Foundation, which is dedicated to mushroom conservation at like governmental level. They were founded down in Chile by Juliana Furci, and I'd really like to go down to Chile and visit Juliana and talk about mushroom conservation. One of the main things they're doing is that at a governmental level, they're trying to get them to add, there's flora and fauna, but they're trying to get them to add the term funga. So flora, fauna, funga are the three things they have to look at if they're going to do like an environmental survey and build something. So, Boom and Flourish, you felt weirdly excited today about finding a puffball. I feel that every time I find a mushroom. I feel weirdly excited about a lot of things, especially with regards to mushrooms and fungi. So, are there fossil mushrooms? Yeah, there are some fossils of mushrooms. There's this amazing kind of mushroom, and we assume it's a mushroom or a fungi. We don't actually totally know, but they look to be like 10 to 40 foot tall, giant club-like structures. And this is in the days before trees had evolved. But they found, and it's something like, over 400 million years old or whatever it is. They found these giant, like long tubular structures that they assumed were essentially giant mushrooms. So imagine seeing like a 30-foot tall mushroom instead of trees. There may have been a point in our planet's history where there was bigger mushrooms than there were plants, which is pretty wild. And we know that because of the fossil record. So, yes, I've seen a fair number of rare mushrooms. There's going to be every year on the West Coast, there's this group called Fundus, which is sort of a biodiversity survey group that's dedicated to conservation. And they run a rare mushroom challenge. And so soon they'll be putting out 5 more rare mushrooms for people to look for this year. And it'll bring the list total up to 25 rare mushrooms. And I'll make some videos about that and show them. But when you find those cool rare mushrooms, you can take a sample of it and send it in to Fundus, and they'll do like DNA sequencing on it. And I think even we're talking about giving away some like tote bags or t-shirts and stuff like that if people are finding and vouchering rare samples. So there are rare mushrooms out there. But the question why we're doing this whole thing isn't are they rare, but it's do we just think they're rare, or is it because they're underreported? The blue-green elf cup is extremely common. You find that all over the place. But rarity of fungi is often a function of your environment. So maybe green-blue elf cup is rare to you because you've only seen it once, but like I've been places where it's on literally every piece of wood. So a lot of mushrooms are only rare because their habitat is limited or has been affected by human activities kind of thing. So I can't really recommend a book on the pharmaceutical benefits of different fungi because I don't necessarily believe that there's that much to that. There is one book, was it Christopher Hodges? There's an okay book on medicinal mushrooms that I would recommend because at least it's science-based. So Christopher Hobbs' Medicinal Mushrooms, The Essential Guide, is probably the best like medicinal mushroom book that's out there that I've seen. He
he makes some claims that are maybe a little outrageous, but I think like most of it's pretty science-based, and I think it's a pretty good book. So Medicinal Mushroom, The Essential Guide, Christopher Hobbs. That's probably the best like medicinal, pharmaceutical type mushroom book you could get. So Chloe, the best bolete guide I've seen is by Arlene Bassett. I think it's the boletes of Eastern North America, and that's probably the best like overview of bolete diversity. But there's just so many boletes out there; it's really difficult to tell, especially in like the Midwest and the East Coast. On the West Coast, we overall have less bolete diversity, but we have much larger boletes. So that's where I get like the big porcini you've seen and stuff like that. But we don't have as many different kinds of boletes. And so I love going back to the East Coast in summer and just seeing the incredible diversity of all the different bolete species and not knowing what half of them are. So, good. I'm glad that I could provide the best information you've seen live. That's definitely what I like to hear here on TikTok. And I've tried talking to TikTok about it too, because I'm like, hey guys, I really like doing education. I'd love to do it on like a bigger stage. They won't make me a partner. They won't like do anything special for me. But I was like, hey, at least let me like go on live and talk to people about mushrooms. Let me go on and give a lecture. Let me give a talk. And I really appreciate when people pick up on that energy and are excited about what I have to talk about and willing to listen and just generally interested in fungi in the way that I am. Because that's my main goal, is just to get you guys maybe not quite as fascinated, but at least partially fascinated by fungi. And I love that. Thank you so much, Bloom and Flourish. I appreciate the panda. Chloe, you found one bolete as big as your face and couldn't figure out what it was. So one of the big things, Chloe, when you look at boletes is look at the texture on the stipe and then look at the pore color and the sort of size of the pores. If you pay a lot of attention to those things, you can usually use that to figure out what bolete it was, at least binning it into some of the different categories. You can always send me a photo too. Chloe was a Patreon subscriber, so I'm always happy to, like, anyone who's a Patreon subscriber, I will actively look at your photos and ID them for you. I'm not going to do that for the like hundreds of other photos I get every day. Sometimes I will, but a lot of the times I just don't have time. So yeah, it's been fun hanging out with you guys. I may go here in a minute because I gotta go get some dinner ready and go do something. But it's been really fun to be on TikTok live with you all. And if you have any more questions for me about mushrooms, now is your time. Got a PhD in biochemistry and able to field most questions about science. I don't super love answering like oddly personal questions, but I will definitely answer anything related to mushrooms and fungi, fermentation, all that kind of stuff. Chaga's okay, but I think that the hype around chaga is definitely overhyped. Shirt infos, you can find this on my website, FascinatedByFungi.com. The link to that website is also in my bio to the FAQ, which has a lot of links to my favorite books, my favorite apps, other creators that I really like, stuff like that. A lot of common questions that I answer on there, including like, what's your favorite mushroom? And like, you can find the link to my podcast on the FAQ page there. Yes, thank you. FascinatedByFungi.com is where you're going to find all that stuff. Do they really help with depression? I would listen to episode, I think, 20 of my podcast, which is about mushrooms and mental health, because I think there's a lot of different ways that we can look at mushrooms and how they can help with depression. Specifically, the idea of like going out and going for walks in nature, taking silly little walks for your silly mental health is definitely a good thing. Forest bathing brings a lot of volatile aromas and good things into your system, helps you feel better. Getting out doing exercise, getting fresh air, getting sunshine, all that kind of stuff is going to help you with your mental health, will make your depression better. We can't talk about psilocybe mushrooms, but episode 7 and episode 20 of my podcast, I do talk about the effects of psilocybe as it pertains to mental health and depression. So you can listen to that. I'd also highly recommend that you check out an episode of Explained on Netflix. There's a mini series called The Mind from Explained on Netflix, and I believe it's episode 2 is all about psychedelics and how they can rewire your brain a little bit. So that's pretty interesting. Ooh, what's my favorite way to eat chanterelles? Depends on the chanterelle. Like, there's different kinds. Like, the ones I get on the East Coast, I think are really like beautiful and fruity and sweet, and so like really just cooking the water out of them and adding some butter, maybe a little bit of thyme, splash of garlic, and just eating them straight up is amazing. out here on the West Coast, the chanterelles are a little bit more earthy, and I don't like the flavor quite as much, so I tend to hide the flavors more in stuff. So I'll put them in stir fries, I put them in soups, I put them in braised meat dishes. Sometimes I'll just take chanterelles, cook them down straight, and then you add like a little bit of chicken broth, something like that, and blitz it up into a really thick soup, which is really good. Hit it with a little bit of cream, maybe grate a nutmeg. All that kind of stuff is really good. Roasting chanterelles can be good. I also really like pickling chanterelles. The one thing I don't do with chanterelles is dry them out, because the texture isn't really preserved, and chanterelles for the most part are textural. You can also take chanterelles while they're raw and shred them, and then cook that down and kind of use it like shredded chicken. That's really good. Favorite type of oyster mushroom is probably just the king trumpet. Those are so big and meaty and fun. Other than that, probably like a pearl or a blue oyster. Yellow oysters aren't my favorite. Pink oysters aren't my favorite. You know, therapy. Yeah, therapy is probably the best thing you can do for your mental health, but therapy is expensive. Let me tell you, as someone who's been in therapy for a long time, it's really freaking expensive. I wouldn't say that drugs are a replacement for therapy. Would not recommend that, but if you are able to couple different types of strategies for dealing with your mental health along with therapy, it's gonna turn out better for you. So anyhow, Kevin De Bruyne is going to sign off here. My name is actually Dr. Gordon Walker. I have a PhD in biochemistry, and I love mushrooms, and I'm so thankful for all you guys for hanging out with me, asking good questions. If you'd like to support me, I have a Patreon. You can subscribe to that. You can follow me on all the different social channels. I got a YouTube, I have a Facebook, Pinterest, Twitter, Instagram. I have merchandise on my website, cool stuff like this shirt or that lobster. I also have discount codes for multiple different mushroom companies, so if you want to go ahead and order your own mushroom kits, like a big bag of mushroom stuff like this that you can fruit your own mushrooms out of, I recommend North Spore or Far West Fungi. Far West Fungi is on the West Coast, North Spore is on the East Coast, depending on which zone of the country you live in. I'd go with one of those two companies. The discount code is called FascinatedByFungi in all caps. You can also get the cool mushroom knife you see me using in a lot of my videos on both those websites. This is an open L mushroom knife. I like it because it's wood, so it's pretty light. I like the curved blade so I don't cut myself when I'm slicing mushrooms. The blade stays sharp, and I also like that it has a little brush, so I can go ahead and clean my mushrooms off while I'm out in the woods. Anyhow, yeah, I appreciate all you guys. Sending you much love from my house to yours, and appreciate everyone hanging out with me. So go check out the Fascinated by Fungi podcast. Please check out my website, fascinatedbyfungi.com. And I appreciate all of you for hanging out with me. So, bye-bye. Have a good one.